Stephen Moffat's adaptation of The Time Traveller's Wife has nearly finished its first season. We're discussing its fifth and penultimate episode today. So we're going to be discussing how our perceptions change between childhood and adulthood, and why going back to childhood places and spaces as an adult can feel surreal and off. What it means to change oneself, especially for another person, sacrificing parts of our identities and what that means. We're going to be discussing family expectations, controversial humour, turning points for characters, causality of time, friend determinism, an interesting new member of the family. And doing all that discussing will be myself, Neo from Australia, along with my friends Ingiga from England and Oliver from England, with both myself and Oliver having read the 2003 novel the show is based on, myself having seen the film as well, and Ingiga being our show-only control viewer. So let's get into the actual events of episode 5. What did you guys think of this episode?
Well, it featured perhaps the most consequential haircut in fictional history.
I know, right? What a haircut. Really interesting. Felt like almost an iteration on last week's dinner party, in that this one is also a sort of dinner party episode.
Yeah.
It strikes me that between the two halves of this episode, I guess the Gomez half and the Clare's family half, I guess if there's a linking idea between those two parts, it's like Henry's world is expanding a little bit, I guess. He learns to rely on Gomez, rely on Clare's sister a little bit, and then, of course, ultimately, you have the drawing, which links the whole thing.
It's really bringing into focus sort of the central theme of the whole thing, this episode, about expecting people to be different to who they are, and whether they live up to your expectations, and whether you're right to have those expectations. Clare's parents are a totally new angle on that, which we've already seen with Gomez and Henry and Clare over the last few episodes.
Yeah, Clare's parents have all those expectations of their children, which are disappointed in some ways and not in others.
With the haircut, I've got to say, the moment before he warped back in time to the bikers in that bizarre scene, I was positive he was about to cut his hair, the way he was looking at the mirror and his kind of headspace in the episode at the time. And then the episode was doing a million other things, and I didn't link the revelation of the sister being a hairdresser, which is a smart change from the novel, to that earlier vibe I was getting from him. So the haircut climax, I mean, I understood it was going to happen a couple of minutes before it was about to happen because it had started moving there. But still, it was nice that I hadn't immediately gone, oh, the sister's a hairdresser, so this is going to happen. And the fact the episode is like all built around a haircut, and that's like the big pivotal dramatic part of the penultimate episode of an HBO show. I love it so much. It's such a nice break from Moffat's more adventure-y stuff to get a show where a haircut is the big dramatic HBO penultimate, huge set piece of the drama thing. I just love that so much. It's so character-based, and it's such a powerful moment. Yeah, I love that a haircut is the big thing here. That's awesome.
Yeah, it's far from foolproof, because having a haircut be so important could easily have come off as silly, but because they've done so much work establishing the older Henry as such a discrete visual presence as well as a character, like when we see young Henry transform into older Henry through the simple act of removing that wig, it's like it really feels like a huge shift.
It's a really clever bit of adaptation as well, where you need a visual language to differentiate two versions of the same character, and so you're using the transition between those two visual languages. I'm glad I hadn't listened to last week's podcast before I saw the episode, because you called that he was going to cut his hair, and it hadn't occurred to me that would be a choice that got made. I in my head, he was just the future version has short hair, and haven't really thought about how we were going to get there. And so the moment came as, I think I got the full force of the reveal. And it's really clever, because you don't recognize it as it's not part of the dialogue, it's not really in the book, so you get the, it sort of sneaks up on you. It's a clever little, big dramatic moment played by surprise.
I love how the director milks it, having him off screen and just his voice coming through for a while, staring on Rose Leslie's face. It's so great to milk all the drama. and emotion out of that moment. So good.
See, it almost made me think it was like a parallel to episode 2 in a sense, because he's bringing the past alive for Claire. Because whereas in that time he was kind of getting his mother to talk to her through time, in this case he's bringing back the older Henry from Claire's childhood to the present.
Yeah.
And there was something really wholesome about that, because earlier on in the episode when he was trying to seduce Claire, he was like, just think about right now, stop holding on to the past. But at the end of the episode he kind of, I guess he concedes in a way and allows that, bringing this thing that brought Claire so much joy in the past, bringing it back in a way for her is something really nice he can do for her, and to not that square that circle, just knot them together, I guess.
Yeah, it's such a literal moment of, it's not that the older Henry is a separate person. Like, he's usually the one arguing this, but he very much does see the older Henry as a separate person himself, how he approaches, this kind of tension about him. But it's realizing that he doesn't have to wait around for older Henry to comfort her. He is Henry. He is older Henry. He can go comfort her. I love that it links them all together in such a beautiful way. I thought it's such a powerful thing that he sacrifices part of himself that he likes, but it's a kind of a superficial. In your 20s, you might treasure your hair, more than you might do later on. It's just such a beautiful moment to me that he realizes through changing part of myself, or through sacrificing something I like, or going through a mild inconvenience for myself, I can bring magic and life to someone who's at a really low point, who's lost all the magic in their life right now and everything looks dismal and grey to them now. I can be the bright spark. It's not older Henry that can just do that. I am Henry. I can do that right now. I just thought it was really well built up, really beautiful, very romantic moment.
Henry finally sees
Where's she going?
the drawing that young Claire did.
She's looking for me.
And he sees the love in the drawing.
He finally realizes who he has to become, a better version of himself. And what better way to do that than to cut his greasy locks off?
Can you help me?
And become the older version of himself.
I'm here now.
A revelation of seeing Henry in the clearing, knowing that the haircut has happened, knowing that the change of clothes has matured him.
Claire Hampshire,
There's a huge sense of relief.
will you marry me?
Oh my God, at last, here he is.
This guy who's patient with me, who's kind to me, I'll let go of the fantasy version and commit to the real one.
Yes, oh my God, yes.
He finally becomes the Henry that Claire wants.
And it's a really great setting for that, the moment being returning to the clearing, which Clara says she's made a big deal about in her head. Returning to the clearing is going to be this big thing. She goes back and it's terrible and ruined, and it maybe always was. I liked that implication, that it's not so much, it's got trashed over time, but also the road was always there, is sort of the implication. She's just, she remembers it differently.
Was I imagining it, or in the final shot when they're kissing and we get the camera kind of swooping back around them and showing more of the clearing, and it was all kind of bathed in that golden light again? Am I imagining it, or was the trash gone in that?
No, that's totally the idea. Yeah,
right. Because that's definitely what I thought. Because it's like the one from her imagination is coming back. That was really nice.
Because it's each other that is the clearing. It's not just the actual physical space there. What makes it special and important and beautiful. I thought that was such a great touch, and it didn't overegg it. I think it didn't zoom in. Where is the Coke bottle gone? What has happened here?
Fade away with a twinkle.
Yeah, I like that you could actually miss it if you're just so focused on them kissing, as is easy to do. I thought that was a really nice touch, played pretty deftly, and it's just a beautiful little visual thing of it's them. They are the clearing. It's when she's alone there and she doesn't want Henry there that it looks so awful, and all the starkness of where it actually is stands out. But when he is there and they are together, suddenly it is just like it always is, because what it always has been is just them together. That's what it is. I thought that was so well done.
I love the way there's so rarely that kind of magical realism visual storytelling in something that's also doing sci-fi.
Yeah.
Like the fantasy sci-fi stuff, the time travel would usually preclude doing all the interesting visual flair stuff. And I think because it's not adventure, because it's drama, the show feels like it's got both. It's doing both. It's got room to do both in it, which I really love. I really love having that flair and that visual storytelling. And even when it's grounded in material stuff, like the cutting of the hair, it's a motif. We understand what it means and no one has to say anything. no one has to say, "Oh, you've decided you're dedicated to becoming my presidential ideal." Oh, great. It's just haircut, and that's the moment. It's great.
Admittedly, in the lead up to this, we had characters going, "Don't ever cut your hair, I love it this way, it really symbolises your youth and wildness." So we got like the inverse of that, perhaps.
That's true. But I suppose that's all set up so the moment itself can turn on an instant.
And I like that the sister, who I really love, the character and the actress I thought was fantastic in this, and she played so well off Theo James too. That worked really well. I love that her being a hairdresser was set up like an actual important part of her characterization, and it was actually important in terms of the family dynamics and like the main theme of the episode. So it never felt just like a random bit of, oh, and this character's a hairdresser, I wonder what this could lead into, because it felt, oh, well, that makes total sense. It's showing the families like this, they resent each other because of that. Just a very nice bit of, this is an actual piece of characterization that is going to come in useful for the main story, but it actually works as its own kind of beat in itself as well. That was nicely done.
It's doing a lot of work in the script, that.
Yeah.
It's efficient, if you want to be clinical about it. It's characterizing her and that relationship, and she's doing a job that is not her parents' ideal of where she would be in her life, but she's happy with it. But also that symbolizes where Claire and Henry end up at the end, using her hairdressing skills, I guess.
I think a small grace note I liked with the sister was just before he gets the haircut, she kind of suggests that if he'd come to her for help, she could have covered up his bruises with concealer and stuff. They could have avoided all that nightmarish, like, cringeness they had at the dinner party. So I think there's a degree to which it also represents Henry being able to rely on other people, rather than just, being all to himself and just sort of slumming it by himself and getting into scrapes.
Yeah, and I like the episode didn't over-explain when the sister was near the clearing, giggling in the bushes. We didn't have like a full-out, well, that was her, and this is how that worked. It's just kind of, you can connect the two things in the episode because it gives you all the pieces you need to go, oh, that's what was happening there.
Yeah, when the sister first popped up and she was pretending to come on to Henry, my first thought was like, oh no, are we really doing this? Is she going to be super horny and try and get in the way of her love and be really annoying? And like, I like that they hard 180'd away from that. Like, that was a feint, so to speak. And I thought, like, certainly, like, by the end of the episode, she's just the fact that she really feels like she has her head on straight. I really like her as a character. She's kind and sane and helpful in the way that none of the other family members are, really, even Claire.
Yeah, I'm a huge fan of that character. And the actor just slotted in so well into the show. And I saw some people, the type of people that aren't liking Moffat's kind of version of Claire, or Moffat and Rose Leslie's version of Claire, which I love, but some people don't. I saw some people kind of shipping Alicia with Henry just because they liked their chemistry together as actors better and thought Alicia is a nicer person and that sort of thing. And I mean, I don't, it's not how I feel, but I get where they're coming from because I thought those actors played so well off each other.
I think there's something nice about the thought that Henry could have, I guess friends in his life, people who are nice to him in a way that isn't like necessarily like romantic or anything, which is also why, the old Gomez scene was so nice as well.
I think that Gomez subplot, which I'm sure we'll get to in more detail, I think that's excellent. I really love the way that his relationship with Henry feels like a slightly different angle on the same basic premise as Claire and Henry's relationship. And the more platonic version of that, but also with slightly different setup time-wise, but also in the actual nature of their relationship to each other. I really like that as a different take on the same basic idea that the whole series is about.
Yeah, I want to talk about the Gomez stuff. The first thing, the friend determinism thing, I think is a difficult concept because it seems so weird and unrelatable, but I think it's not really, because I think friendships tend to be formed out of things like proximity. Friendships don't tend to just spawn out of these two people, no matter where they are, would be a good fit and get on well together. Therefore, somehow they're going to, come and merge together. Most friendships are like two people happen to be in the same spot for whatever reason, whether it's like practically they have to go to school or work or wherever, they're in the same environment, therefore they're going to interact a lot. I think that's a type of like determinism, sort of. You're kind of being forced into a space, and then the friendship is just kind of spawning out of, well, you're together, so, make the best of it from what you will.
In light of that, the fact that Gomez calls Henry comrade all the time, and that was the whole thing, that feels almost symbolic, like a representative of the fact that they're bonded by a shared, well, not necessarily a shared struggle, but in the sense that because Gomez is like helping out Henry and kind of duty bound to kind of help Henry with his time travel like escapades where possible, that feels like something. And also, of course, then there's the element of Clare as well. They both care about Clare. So there's a degree of rather than falling in love, which they brought up in previous episodes, something you fall into. Friendship is something that I guess you forge, or you work at it, just like you do with a romantic relationship. But I guess you work at it from a different kind of angle. It's not in the sense of working towards like building your ideal person. It's just a sense of working together to, I guess, carry on living or something like that.
Yeah, I think it's basically an arranged friendship, and I don't think that's weird at all. I think loads, maybe most friendships are kind of fundamentally like that, or at least start like that. So it's interesting to do it in such like a high concept. We're friends because we're friends, causality of time stuff. But I don't think it's that unrelatable or anything. Yeah.
Yeah, the comrade thing, they sort of do have the same struggle because they've both been told they're going to be best friends and they don't have a say in it. They're united by the fact that they've been forced together in the way that, lots of friendships start by being in proximity, like you say. And if you told yourself when you first met whoever your closest friend is now that you would be best friends for the rest of your life, I think for most people it would be a surprise. Maybe not quite as aggressive as the two of them are to each other in resisting it, but generally you don't meet someone and go, oh, we're just going to be best friends forever.
Yeah.
You forge shared experiences and shared struggles.
It's just like one of the earlier episodes with the older versions of Henry and Claire were saying about falling in love, not being who you expect or who you might, think your type is or anything like that. It's the same with friends. You see that all the time with people. Their closest friends might be totally different. Yeah, it's the same. It's the same as love, really. It's you're not matching up with little clones of yourself so much as who knows who you're going to be in proximity with, or who you're going to click with, or who you're going to have a shared struggle with, and therefore have that kind of reliability and closeness with. Yeah, I think it's really interesting.
It struck me that the key moment with Gomez was like the moment when he's the most honest, because whereas earlier on in the episode he's kind of being sort of lying about him not being in love with Claire or whatever. Later on in the episode when we meet old Gomez, he says what he says to Henry. He says, you being gone would break my heart, and that's something that he's never said before, and it's a very, really powerfully honest admission. And that's kind of even though young Henry hasn't lived through whatever experiences would make him that close with Gomez, it's believable. Like, it's completely sincere on Gomez's part, even though Gomez is always masking it with kind of like, I guess, kind of jocular like banter and such. When he says that, it's from the heart, and it's really quite a transformative moment, I think, for the relationship and that character. It was really, really well played. I loved it.
I really like that. I don't think they're trying to like really antagonize each other. I think they're just both being themselves, but it really is antagonizing each other. Like when Henry does a very Mark from Joking Apart-esque thing, and he just says this kind of witty quip insult just because that's like how his mind works. That's just where he kind of jumps to. And it pisses Gomez off. Why are you insulting me? And they like, the conversation ends, there's the hang up and everything. I don't think Henry wants to antagonize this guy, and he knows he's meant to be friends with him. It's just like, this is who I am, and I'm young enough that I don't have as much control or thought over my actions yet. And so I like that it's that kind of tricky thing where you might be wanting to make peace with someone or trying to make friends with someone because, your girlfriends might be friends or anything like that. But it's just tricky because you are who you are and they are who they are. And there's that tricky testing ground at the start of things. And that's honestly what's happening with young Henry and young Claire as well. When they both say, go easy on each other, it's that they're still antagonizing each other just on the basis of what their personalities are like right now, and that they haven't quite clicked into an equilibrium yet. I think that's all quite realistic and interesting.
It's interesting that the foreknowledge is sort of the central thing about time travel, rather than the actual displacement in time. The most impactful thing on the relationships is the information, the understanding of where you're going to end up. That's how you get the drama in this series out of a normal relationship, is you tell the people in that relationship, where they're going to end up. Where all the stuff like actually traveling to the future and meeting future Gomez is more about informing the relationship as it exists in the present, which is interesting, I think.
I guess it's because of the nature of Henry's time travel being that he's stuck for a short period and he's pings back. Whereas if he was there like for, several weeks at a time, that might change the entire like structure and nature of the story. So I guess like the story is set up in a careful way so that I guess the time traveling itself doesn't take huge precedence over just the element of knowledge being in the wrong place.
There is a sort of sequence to their relationship when Henry meets Clare. It is the first time, sort of, for both of them from a specific angle. Like, there's some amount of linearity.
I was just going to say, I want to shout out to Gomez blasting Pink as he drove up in the car. That was gloriously camp for a moment.
That his speech to the bikers. How did you guys find that? How it was being played? What the actor was doing there?
I felt the fact that Moffat seemed scared to give the bikers any dialogue kind of undercut it slightly. It made it feel a bit like it was a bit too like fantasist. I think for me. It didn't entirely work, but I like the idea of it. Him just showing up, pretending to be this huge hacker, elite lawyer with all the power to be bring down on their heads, and then just turning out that he was making it all up. Like that's fun. The scene itself was a little bit like. You always like, is there music going off in your head when you wrote this? Like, come on.
It's very cartoonish. I did like the payoff that there were no cameras, but in the moment, I was like, this feels like a different show. What he's doing there.
There's something really interesting in comparison between Gomez and Moffat's other, I guess, secondary men in his other shows. Where you've always got...
Remember, Neil hasn't watched Sherlock before you go any further.
I was going to Rory, first of all.
Good move.
Because Rory's very much the alternate model of masculinity. He's less good at the swaggering than Doctor Who himself is. And you've got the same thing here with Gomez, where this feels like it's got shades of The Last Centurion... full dress up Rory mode, where he's not actually very good at it, but he's in the costume and he's given it a damn go. Gomez feels like that to me.
I think the real key there is that Moffat has a real respect for that kind of almost second place guy who isn't the flashy hero, but is just the guy who just who is maybe a bit mediocre in some ways. Maybe he isn't the prettiest, isn't the coolest, but he will step up when the occasion calls. He's fundamentally good. Even if he's not perfect, even if he's not the most amazing hero. I think that's a real, and you can see why that idea appeals to Moffat so much and why he has kind of given Gomez this kind of material to that you kind of cheer for him in some ways.
Yeah, it's the Russell T Davies and Moffat dynamic, basically.
Oh, I'd not thought of that. There's very much, they're all iterations, interestingly, on the same man, in that Rory and Gomez putting on the swagger and pretending to be cool time travel badasses like their respective main characters. That's also what the main characters themselves do. They also put it on and play it up, and that's not really who they are. But it's all iterations on the same idea. The Doctor and Henry are just better practiced at the time travel badassing. And so it's fun to see Gomez and Rory being the less practiced, more, I guess, internal versions of those characters, showing off the vulnerable side that they all have.
It's also fun when the Gomez gets to be, gets to lord it over the Henry, like in this case where, Henry's helpless, he's been beaten up on the ground, and Gomez gets to show up and be like the big lawyer dude and actually save Henry's bacon. I think that's really, obviously that's really fun, for a kind of fun reversal of their dynamic.
What's the term Henry uses for people that don't time travel in the episode?
I think he said non-time travel people.
No, that's a mouthful.
Yeah, as yet not time travelled child.
Do you want to talk about the dinner scene?
Yeah, well, if we can bear to. I could barely watch it on both times.
I loved it. I loved it so much. I like that. I like that sort of humor. I thought that was so good. All the build-up she was doing. her not knowing how he was going to come out. It was such great Moffat comedy. Her face when she realized what she'd inadvertently set up to her family was so funny. And I knew what sort of reactions this would get among different people. But yeah, this was such a Moffat type of comedy to... Yeah. How did you guys take the domestic violence poking there?
I think it could have landed wrong, but the fact that in the scene outside when they first meet and they're having tea or whatever, and Claire doesn't give Henry Gomez's name and doesn't swoop in to save him, setting up that she thinks this is all very fun and she's happy to land him in the deep end, setting that up at the beginning and then her landing herself in the deep end later, that makes it a lot more fun for me. I
think also Claire's brother taking it quite seriously and really poking at it, I think also kind of, like, it wasn't like Moffat was playing the moment for laughs and then all the characters were kind of laughing at it. Like, everyone was clearly disturbed by Henry being supposedly beaten up, perhaps by Claire. Like, it wasn't just kind of let go as a ha-ha, isn't it funny to see men being beat up thing. Like, we had a character really interrogating it and unhappy about it. So I felt like it wasn't just thrown out there in a purely insensitive way or anything.
The brother kind of seemed like he was relishing, like, exposing the lie and, like, just really sort of calling them out and making them squirm from their incredibly bad lying. And, like, even though, like, everyone around the table was just, you know, please just let it slip, let it slide, okay, leave it alone, let them have their secrets or whatever. He was really persistently digging into them and just sort of being the kind of logician, beat boop, I'm very smart about it. I think it was really good characterization because they didn't need to have him sort of go on some huge, like, nerd rant or whatever, but just through the action of him really turning the screw on Claire, you get a very clear sense of what kind of guy he is, and of course, like, how his career kind of shapes how he thinks about himself, and just what his role in that family is like.
I think he might have been thinking, or someone at that table might have been thinking, Henry's earlier comment about, well, I guess having two lawyers in your household is very convenient when you want to break the law, might have almost been a cry for help. Like, it's him trying to say, this is how Claire gets away with what she's doing to me, is that she is totally covered by having these, you know, big lawyers in the family. Like, it's quite an arresting thing how you could take the implications of what didn't actually happen, but it seems like might have happened there with the domestic violence.
He's such a great bit antagonist. Claire's line about how he managed to become a lawyer without getting noticeably worse. Killer. Excellent.
What did the parents think of Henry being beat up? They seemed just kind of taken aback, but not like horrified. But I don't know what everyone was actually thinking at that table, because that doesn't look like a falling down in the shower thing. But I don't know if it really looks like a Claire beating him up thing either. Like, a lot of those look like big impact, like strong knuckle wounds as well. It's an incomprehensible situation, really, I suppose.
I think that's it. It's playing the absurdity.
I think from the lawyer comments that Henry made earlier, I think maybe they were getting an impression that he was involved in crime or, like, bad business or, I don't know, or, like, whatever you want to think of. And you know, him turning up suddenly all beaten up and having been in some sort of fight and there being no clear explanation for it. I mean, that could link into that as well. But at the same time, they seem more just concerned about, like, his quote unquote prospects. And then at the end of the whole dinner scene, when they've gone away, the mother points out, did she say married? And she's got this big, super grin on her face. So I think that there's kind of a sense that the parents are not actually really that concerned with the specifics so much as just the superficial idea of, like, respectability or, like, you know, following the right track or what they perceive as the right track.
They're not tuned into the lives of the daughters, I think, and by extension Henry. It's like that earlier with our youngest Clare actress. One of the first times we saw her, we saw the dad just paying attention to the son and just hanging out with the son, and that's why she could go steal clothes for Henry, because, you know, the dad wasn't paying attention to his room or whatever. They're clicking with the son because the son's a lawyer, like they want him to be. They're in total denial. Well, the dad's not saying anything, and the mum's in total denial about what Alicia is. They seem kind of approving of Claire, just in that she's going for art, but Claire's annoyed that they're not specifically on the level of she's a student, and everything like that. So yeah, I don't think they're really that clued into the daughters or Henry. The mum's obviously pretty zonked out. We've seen the antidepressants and stuff in the flashbacks, and the dad just seems kind of, you know, in his own little world with his son. So yeah. And the housekeeper, I really liked how that was played. I love that it's, you know, the episode goes into it a lot, but that young Claire saw the housekeeper as like a maternal figure that really cared about them and could tell them apart. And part of that is, even if you are someone that actually loves a child, like an actual parent, children say so much stuff at such speed every day. And an adult's got so much other stuff going on that it isn't a mark of not loving them to confuse, I couldn't remember what imaginary person you were talking about, you know, 20 years ago, or I couldn't keep this straight with another kid. That's not a mark of not being loved at all, you know, because children say so much stuff. And for the child, especially as a child, you're entirely like selfish. Everything is singular to your experience. So you're not going to think an adult's having a million things going on. And Claire at this age is still, she's an adult, but she hasn't kind of made that bridge to kind of contextualize what her childhood experiences were like yet. But that's, you know, partly what this episode is about. Anyway, yeah, so I love that she saw the housekeeper as like a genial, proper, loving, like motherly figure, especially since her mother was, you know, kind of absent in a sense. And then the housekeeper just kind of like, I don't know if I'd even say gently, because I don't think she's trying to give adult Claire a teaching moment. I think it's just, you know, what it is like.
It's very matter of fact, isn't it? She's very matter of fact about it.
Yeah, I'm employed by you. Like, you're a bunch of rich people I work for. Like, this isn't an antagonistic thing, but, you know, my job is to like make food for you and stuff. This isn't a love thing. You know, it's not my job to remember all your childhood stuff, you know, really.
Yeah.
Between you and your sisters, you're two rich kids that babble away at me and I make food for you.
There was a moment of class self-awareness from Claire almost.
Yeah.
when the housekeeper was offering to like make tea or coffee, and Claire was just staring at her. I was like, oh, right, yes. And also that mention that the housekeeper had of, you know, marry rich or you'll end up slaving away at a sink for the rest of your life. And then you have a shot of her at the sink. And that's sort of Claire being like, oh no, my childhood wasn't this magical fairyland where everyone was super happy and everything was perfect. Actually, you know, there's like inequality exists. Shock.
Yeah. I like that better than the fireplace, which was an effective symbol, but the housekeeper I thought was a really interesting way to do that same beat.
Yeah, especially the agency that she's got there and sort of shutting down Claire's perspective on their relationship, almost. Like, she's kindly, but she's also not Claire's mum. Yeah. And that's very much, she goes, no, this is my job. This is what I'm paid to do. It's the whole sequence feels very awkward around Claire's class in the way that class is, right? Having a housekeeper, especially if you're an art student, is something that makes you awkward and you don't feel comfortable with.
You can see why young Claire hooked into Henry so much. Like, the dad isn't that interested in her. The mum's clearly got her own things going on and is pretty absent. The housekeeper is a employee. Brother got the own stuff going on with the dad. Sister, yeah, but pretty young. You know, when Claire herself was younger, it makes sense why she got so attached to this older man showing lots of interest in her. Yeah.
I think there's probably a link, and I'm sure people have probably written entire like theses about this, but the degree to which Claire, coming from a rich family and having this huge meadow, you know, where she can run off to and meet Henry in secret and stuff and all that, and the way in which it's intrinsic to her whole character and journey, there seems to be a link between that and what she ends up with in this sort of almost arranged relationship with this kind of perfect man. There's something there, like that, and you know, he even gives her tips on like a place to live that will be really affordable and all that stuff. Like, it's almost kind of given to her in a way. It feels like there's some sort of implicit parallel or almost contrast between that and her kind of her upbringing of means, shall we say?
Yeah, I think he stunts her in some. She was already getting plenty stunted by her family, but I think, like we talked about, getting her that place, and even her like years of freedom are like sanctioned by him, and like they're his advice. Go have years of freedom before you know meet me again. Yeah. I mean, we see eventually she's going to be an old woman, so there's going to be a lot of time where she grows more and everything, but it's a kind of tragic thing to me that her life is so kind of enclosed by her family. And then, as great as her and Henry are together a lot of the time, so much of her life is just kind of moved into, now I'm enclosed by Henry. Yeah. It's especially with that class element. It's like she never had to struggle, which is, it's not just me saying, oh, people should have to, go through tough times. It's like for her own sake, for her own identity cultivation, I think she would have liked that in a way and benefited from it, to have had to scrape a bit more on her own, maybe.
There's something really interesting in the contradiction in the class of time travel as it applies to Henry, where he's constantly on the streets, naked, fighting people, right? Which is very much coded as sort of being made suddenly homeless several times a week.
Although admittedly now it does seem more like rich people behaviour, going insane in the middle of the street, taking your clothes off and taking people, but that's by the by.
It's true. But he gives his friends stock tips, which aesthetically, if nothing else, is rich people money.
Yeah. That's
how rich people do money. So there's an interesting contradiction where his time travel is both a means to wealth and also this sort of this thing that throws him into literal poverty of not having clothes on his back all the time, just temporarily for a moment, and then he's back to giving stock tips. There's something interesting there.
Yeah, he really defines himself as a survivor and a criminal, but when he's caught by the police, his mantra always kind of is, well, I'm going to zap out of here. Like they can put me in a cell, but they can't keep me in a cell, which is, a luxury not afforded to most criminals. But he definitely, like we saw with young Henry when he was training him, I think Henry's self-image very much is, I'm a scrappy survivor, criminal. I had to get good at stealing, fighting, running. That's who I am. I can't conceive of myself without running, fighting, stealing. So there's a lot of interesting stuff for his characterization there.
Down to his short life expectancy.
And especially with the younger versions of Henry, Moffat links in a real sense of that self-image of resentment and anger over this is how he has to live his life because this is what his condition is.
He's angry, not at the kid, not at his childhood self. He's just angry that this happened, trying to pretend he's all right with it and being all bristle and unemotional and rubbish, nonsense, come on.
Yeah. And I guess ultimately in his relationship in his marriage to Clare, ultimately, that gives him, I guess, a point to which he always returns, and a degree to which, even though he's constantly in this cycle of, I guess, slipping between comfort and danger and desperation and poverty and imprisonment and escape, and I guess despite all of those things kind of rolling around, when he's with Clare, that's like an actual structure for his life to slot into. It's almost like the one thing that can actually keep him contained, even though he slips out of any like prison or whatever prison cell. He is, by being with Clare, that's an actual, I guess, something that actually encloses him in a way.
I think that's why he changes as a person. Like, I think a lot of people would say improves. Some people wouldn't. Ingrid wouldn't. Because he has someone, I think this is what actually really attracts him to Clare, is that she has these high expectations of him. Ingrid accepted him as he was. I'm not saying that's a bad thing, but I think he's very attracted to Clare, kind of wanting him to be different or wanting him to be better. Like, he bristles at it all the time, but I think that's very magnetic to him. This thought that I can be more than what I'm being now and what I have been in my life so far. Not only can I be more, but this person loves that I'll be more and, loves all that more. I think that he has something to aspire to comes from Clare and not from his life beforehand. Like his father, who I'm sure we'll see more of eventually, is kind of, would be in a sorry state after the mother died, of course. Ingrid totally accepts him kind of where he is. And they both have fights with that kind of similar personalities there. But and I think what this episode is really playing with is that acceptance of someone exactly as they are can be a good thing and can be a bad thing. And it can be a romantic thing and it can be not be a romantic thing. there's a kind of fine line and there's a lot of nuance in between. You shouldn't change yourself unduly for a person, but also a person kind of seeing you could be more, or you could actually achieve so and so, can be a very powerful and healthy thing, I think. And I thought that little grey area there, I think, is really fertile storytelling ground. And I think it's great that the episode's got people debating those ideas a lot. Like, I'm sure we'll get around to the last lines of the episode and why those are a bit controversial. But I think it's an interesting topic. To what extent is it healthy or not to kind of see my partner could be a bit different? To what extent is that totally messed up? Or to what extent is that kind of good and romantically aspirational? In any case, I think that's part of why Henry's attracted to Claire.
And I think on looking at the portrait, sort of the news drawing that Claire did of him, when on young Henry seeing that, I think he really felt he wanted to be the recipient of that kind of adoration that went into that picture. And it's something that he realised he couldn't really have in his current, scrappy self. But if he just smartened himself up a bit and sort of maybe aspires to something, rather than just, okay, I could die any second, who cares? Then he could actually get that kind of validation and affection that he, I guess, craves.
She takes Henry 28.
Smaller than I thought.
But then I suppose everything's bigger when you're little.
And puts him in the environment where she'd always known that older, wiser Henry.
You keep looking disappointed that I'm not him.
Well, you keep not being him.
She releases her frustration by being frustrated with him.
This is the absolute climax of Claire's dissatisfaction about Henry not being who she expected.
Careful.
She's got these treasured memories.
It's kind of old.
It's old and really special to me.
And here is reality striding negligently through them all.
The past is what didn't kill you. The future is what definitely will, and in between is the only thing that matters.
More than anything, he wants to cling on to now and not fall off into another time.
It is interesting that he's not cutting his hair because he wants to be the person Claire wants him to be. Because he thinks that's a better person. I don't think that's how the moment's played. I think it's played as him cutting his hair because he wants to be with Claire and he wants to be the best person for Claire, not because he wants to be the presidential version of himself that she wants him to be. Which is interesting. That's sacrifice, right?
If you wanted to be cynical, and I'm sure this reading is not lost on Moffat at all, in a way, the haircut could just be an extension of the earlier scene where he's trying to bang Claire. I mean, he's doing all this to get in bed with Claire. You could almost say it like that. So, because, the whole speech about, it's just you and me right now in this moment, that doesn't work. So he just, okay, fuck it, I'll cut my hair. she likes me now. But, at the same time, that is kind of his desire to sort of make Claire, happy in a way, happy with him and stop, kind of pushing him away. Is kind of what pushes him to do it. Not necessarily because he actually, I really want to be that guy. I really like that guy now.
And she clearly prefers him.
Worst date ever. Someone else is having my erection. It's kind of falling in love with someone and realizing that they kind of prefer your older brother, basically. And you're wondering, well, how am I going to become that guy?
I think it's the moment where he realizes he kind of lives up to his own ethos there, where he's the one saying there's only now, stop thinking about past and future. I think that point with the haircut is when he realizes future Henry isn't, future Henry. There is no past Henry, there is no future Henry, there's just me. I don't have to wait around for the presidential Henry to go comfort her. I am presidential Henry. I can go comfort her. I can be that person right there. So I think he's kind of living up to his own words there. But I think that speech as well, the big mindfulness speech of there's only right now, stop, you non-time travel people never understand. You just don't get it, do you? I think that I've seen some people are kind of bristling at, they think Claire's the only one being a dick in this relationship. And therefore, when they're doing the doomsday thing of their hands against the wall to each other and saying, go easy on me, will you go easy on me too? That exchange I thought was a nice equalizing thing. I see some people didn't like it because they felt, hey, only Claire is being the dick here. What does Henry have to apologize for? But he's throwing around her stuff, which she's very clearly saying is important to her. And, he has every reason to resent Claire being so hung up on kind of a different man. But at the same time, I don't think he's making it easy on her either. And he doesn't have to. But I think that this kind of thinking of, well, she's not doing that, so he doesn't have to do that, that's not relationship thinking, is it? That person, did this, and two wrongs make a right. I can treat her badly because she's treating me badly. That's not couple thinking at all. And I see a lot of people are approaching the episode like that, and like they're right in that. Yes, she's doing this bad, and then he's doing this bad, but she did this first, and she started, and he started that. But that's not. There's no relationship when you think like that. When it's like counting who started this and who started that and who's keeping score of the slights against each other. There's no love there. And I think they kind of mature away from that in this episode when they kind of agree, let's have mercy on each other. It's the mercy just isn't in one direction in this episode. I think the mercy is going both ways, and that's why the ending has that kind of equalizing effect.
The significance of that note is just stop trying to judge this young man by the standards of who he manages to make himself into. Just take him as who he is.
What's that?
Mercy.
There's something in all relationships, romantic or not, about letting go of that kind of logic of scorekeeping and making sure that what you get for someone for their birthday is of roughly equal value to what they got for your birthday. All that from the outside, it's very easy to analyze and pick apart. You just have to let go of, because you can't with that sort of individualistic thinking.
Emotions are not mathematical.
Exactly.
It's not a game. There's no referee. Like when you're keeping score, there is literally you and the other person. And the keeping score is antagonizing the other person, and the relationship is two people. So you're making the relationship worse for where do the points go? There's nothing to be won. There's nothing to be gained from this kind of thinking.
You're introducing an imaginary referee to the relationship. A third man.
Yeah, and you totally get why people enter into this sort of thinking, because it's kind of how you might approach the world generally. But yeah, I think Nate said this quite well in the episode 4 discussion we did. It's you have to kind of approach marriage and relationships in a different kind of thinking to your individual thinking, because you're not an individual anymore. It's a couple. It's a different paradigm there, and I'm enjoying seeing the two characters kind of grow into that more in this episode. I think they both grew up a lot in this episode, which I really appreciated. I think that's the clearing works so well as a kind of symbol for the kind of difference in expectations and how being part of a couple, it's like the combined strength of them is what makes the clearing beautiful again at the end. I think they're really coming to a more equalizing, not scorekeeping way of looking at each other now, which I really like. And then they're not just seeing these idolizations of each other and of themselves as well. Henry's kind of not separating himself from presidential Henry as much because he's got the short hair now. And I think Claire's coming to grips more with her child self and what the world was actually like then.
Claire has a fairy tale version of her past and a fairy tale version of her future.
So I think that's working. Both Henry's kind of actualization and Claire kind of maturing past the fairy tale versions of how she perceives her past and her future.
That logic of scorekeeping is sort of the market approach to relationships. When people talk about relationships like they work like a market, like you give in and you get out in the same way that you do a financial transaction. That extremely gross way of thinking about it, that's all centered on individualism. But like Nate said, you have to let go of the idea of individualism to a degree, because, in any scenario, but especially in any kind of relationship, you are not acting as one person, you are acting as part of a group. And that's the whole thing about the time travel and the way the two influence each other back and forth. It's about that sort of symbiosis. They are both each other's origins. They are where each other come from and where each other go to. They're one thing. They're tied together by the universe. It's almost... I think you can make a strong argument that the degree to which they are intertwined isn't entirely healthy, but they are that intertwined. That's the relationship. That's what a relationship is.
I think there's so much about relationships, especially long-lasting ones, that will come off as toxic to a lot of people or kind of alien or hard to understand. I think unconditional love is another one that can confuse a lot of people who maybe, haven't had the fortune, I guess, to have been in relationships like that, romantic or otherwise, where, the love is not conditional on you're going to keep being like this or you're going to do that, but it's, I'm going to love you no matter what you do, for better or worse. And I think the time travel thing is an interesting way to explore that, because Claire's going to be seeing Henry at all these different ages, and vice versa. And the love is a kind of current that's running through there, irrespective of how they're actually acting or what they're doing at these different ages. The love is there anyway, which is kind of a crazy concept when you think about it, but it's like the time travel being used as a metaphor for a very real thing, that's a common type of love. People loving each other no matter what has happened or what is going to happen or what will happen or what is happening now. Yeah. And
that angle on the haircut and all the things it symbolizes, where you think that someone doesn't have to change. Someone shouldn't have to change for a relationship. And ideally, I suppose that's true, but that's not the point. People will change. That's the point.
Yeah, people will change anyway, just hope it's changed in a good way.
Exactly. You can change together, or you can change apart. Make your choice.
Young Henry versus old Henry, this is part of the complexity of Stephen's writing. He wanted to create two characters within the same person. The young, dumb, wild one, and the aged, wiser, more thoughtful Henry.
I've missed you.
Well, you just slept with me. The older Henry helps Claire to stay on track, to keep faith.
How does he get to be you?
And then she discovers what every young couple discovers about each other. Oh, I've got a lot of work to do before that's possible.
So hopefully after the events of this episode, Claire won't feel like she's going to hell every time they have sex anymore. I thought there was an interesting note earlier on when they were in the shop and that old dude was giving them like evil eyes from behind. when Claire mentioned that it was like cheating on the man of her dreams with his hot kid brother, and Henry seemed quite excited by that idea. So the idea of like framing their relationship as almost this illicit, sort of almost pornographic kind of premise, like this salacious kind of sensationalistic sort of like I guess taboo of a sense, and in the sense of the I guess the fleeting nature of that kind of appeals to Henry in a sort of this dark way, but it's not something that's sustainable. It's not something that like would lead to their growth, I guess. So like now that's out of the way, it's not this taboo anymore. Now that they've actually, I guess they've committed to becoming like something that's actually real, rather than just like a temporary thing or like an interstitial thing before the real Henry shows up.
I think that the different Henry stuff, I think, works really well as that kind of externalizing the projections we have for other people. Like I know we all would have seen in relationships where one of them has clearly gotten into it, not really on the basis of who the person is, but on the basis of who they want them to be, or who they think they could be, or who they can fix them into being. It's a classic tale, so many relationships like this. I think the two Henrys kind of work as a kind of literal way of doing that. Like Claire is with this Henry kind of on the basis of you're eventually going to be this man I love, and you're not now really, but you're going to be one day. And it's so interesting to get this kind of the time travel concept where she's right, he actually will be that one day. It's not just a fantasy like in real life, someone thinking, well, this guy's actually going to be so-and-so one day, I know I can totally straighten him up into that. Here, she knows he will straighten up into that, but that doesn't make it's not really working now until they start not thinking that way so much at the end.
Yeah, her mistake is separating them out as two people rather than a continuum. Like it's like a frog boiling thing. He will become that guy, but that's the thing that's happening constantly. It's not a thing that there won't be a sudden switch flip and the good one appears. Well, I suppose that is almost sort of what happened at the end of this episode. He cut his hair. That was almost like a switch flip. But what happened was, like, he didn't fundamentally, he wasn't suddenly replaced with the 41-year-old Henry. It was just sensing that small visual difference, and she saw, like, the fact that, in one instance, like, the young Henry and the old Henry, like, merged, and that, I guess it sort of collapsed this idea of them being two separate ones into a single continuum of Henry.
It's him deciding to be that person.
Yes, exactly.
Which is why it makes sense paired with the marriage stuff, right? Because it's about that decision of they're both aesthetic as well. You make a change to the way you are. It's almost like getting a haircut for a wedding. But you are making that decision, and you're not the person you're going to be yet, but you're deciding that that's who you're going to be. You are going to reach that point.
That's why you have vows at a marriage. That's the point. That's why it's vows.
Yeah.
You know?
I really don't think it's actually the haircut, like the visuals of the haircut, so much as he just did something like that. He sacrificed part of himself for her. He's caring for her, which is what older Henry always did. He's coming out there and he's done something to try and make her life better. They're not just together kind of from that arranged marriage thing anymore. He's come down there and done a kindness to her and done a really special, unpredictable thing to make her happy. I think it's that more so than the actual visuals that gives her that little montage of this is the same Henry, this is the same man. It's because he's just done, the kind of action that she recognizes as Henry, that she loves about Henry, more than just, oh, you look like him now, I think. Because like she says, she has that line, I didn't notice he was hot, I was in love with him. Yeah, so I think it's not so much the visual aspect as the romantic aspect of what he's done there. The visual aspect's for us, the viewers.
Yeah, it's the shorthand. Short hair shorthand. But that is, as shorthand, that is pretty stunning stuff. From a TV point of view, having set out two versions of the characters, then having a moment where one of them decides to do something which character-wise, but also visually symbolizes becoming the later version of the character. It's just great TV. There's a really interesting thing in Doctor Who brained stuff. All the stuff that does this kind of time travel storytelling with multiple versions of the same character. It plays a lot with plurality, especially in the words, in the dialogue. There's a lot of, you are talking to yourself kind of thing. It does a lot of suggesting that one person is two people, or going the other way and suggesting that the two people are the same person. So much that it is really easy to forget that they are literally the same person. This Henry, who we've been watching meet Clare for the first time, literally is the same one as the old Henry we see later. They're literally the same person at two different points in time. It's really easy to get that mixed up, which is why the haircut, uniting the two of them, sort of fusing the ends of their timeline together. That's why that's such a great moment. It is this big statement. Look, they're the same person.
Since we're sort of circling around it, I'm curious about what the controversy was over those final lines. When Hare says, I loved you since the moment I met you in that stupid library, I was just expecting someone else. And Henry says, okay, I can be someone else. What's sort of, in the sense that, is that a revelation in the sense when Henry says, that when Claire says that she already loved him the moment she met him, in the library, is there something thorny about Henry saying that I can do that, I can be someone else? What's the deal there?
There's a couple of things, I think. And I get it. It's a line that can be seen as really unhealthy and sad and toxic in some ways, sure. But I think that's pulling it out of the show a bit. For the first thing, yes, it's being played with romantic music and it's a big swelling climax, but it's a TV show. So it crests, and each episode has its own little arc. Moffat isn't shilling these things to you and saying, take them as I'm giving to you now and I'm never going to reflect on them or probe them again. He will. He's already done that across various things he's raised up in earlier episodes. He'll then, kind of he'll interrogate in later episodes again. We saw this, he litigated the grooming stuff perhaps too much. So I don't buy that Moffat is saying this is totally healthy and good and you should be cheering for it right now and I'm never going to readdress this idea again. That's not what's going on, in the first place. I don't think. Just by nature of it being TV, that's not how we can have another story next week. Hopefully we can have another season or two. This stuff is going to continue to be interrogated. The actual line itself, if someone in real life, in a relationship kind of out of context, says, I can be somebody else for you, yeah, that does sound unhealthy, sure.
But I think in this context, the point is more that And the idea of the word somebody else doesn't necessarily mean someone like, I don't know, Gomez, like a completely different human being. I sense like, you like today is a different person from you like 2 years ago. So I think like someone else, that's a really broad umbrella, the words like being someone else. And I think just because the episode has set up this idea of changing who you are, like for the better, like developing, growing as a person, I think it just, rather than Henry being like, I am now going to throw out everything about my own identity and become devoted to to being something that I am not. I think the point is more that he's accepting the idea that he can grow, and just not be the same as he's always been, but that he can develop. I guess I think I realize out of context it comes off as like a harsh thing, but I think the show has like set up enough that you can probably infer what's actually meant there. And
it's coming right off the back of like a montage and an exchange, which is kind of threading the idea that older Henry, like, he's kind of imagined up in a way. He's part of younger Claire, as we've seen, very fantastical kind of sheltered view of the world. Like, she's built this kind of fantasy version of things and a very imaginative version of things, as children do, of course. And she's kind of linked that through with the kindness Henry's doing now to kind of realize older Henry isn't a separate person, I think is part of what she's realizing there. And then he's kind of rejoining that with, well, I can be, I can change a little. I can kind of be that person for you. I think it's kind of earned on the back that it's not like she's going, fuck young Henry, I only want old Henry who's totally real and was totally as cool as I imagined. We just had that montage of her like linking through, they're the same person.
Your belief in the fantasy, the final moments of this say, I think, can bring about the fantasy. The version of your clearing in your childhood memories doesn't actually exist anymore, and it probably never did. But your belief in this other person and your belief that he can be as good as he is in that sort of imagined fantasy version, that belief will bring the magic back. It's very much a Moffat trope.
I hadn't thought of this, but like in the context of the childhood clearing memories kind of being fictitious to a way, I think it's also worth considering. There's a school of thought that suggests that we're always performing throughout our lives, and when older Henry goes back to visit child Clare and feel that almost kind of paternal role and be this kind of like presidential guy, like there's an extent to which that is kind of a performance as well. Like not necessarily one that he's thinking about. Oh, I'm going to pretend to be cool for young Clare, not like that. But it's just by fulfilling the role and being this kindly guy towards young Clare. Like he is giving a particular version of himself. He's creating that version of himself through his actions. So I think there's a degree to which, even in relationships, you're always like, whoever you're interacting with at any given time, you're giving a different performance of your identity and who you are. So it's always constructed in some way.
That's the episode goes through that with the sister, I think it was, talking about the moment you realize your parents are just people. Like that's kids don't think this way. They think teachers live at the school and they think they're actually like, how they're performing in the classroom. They think their parents are like what the parents, present to the child. And that's why they're freaked out if they like hear an argument or just an adult kind of conversation parents might be having, when they think the child's not around. And like we're getting the classic maturation thing of realizing, oh, my parents are just people. They're not like God's controlling, how life works or anything. They're just two regular people. That's discussed in the episode. Yeah. The performativity of people is, I think that's what Claire's realizing, is that older Henry is real, but insofar as he's just Henry being that person, which any Henry can do because they're all the same Henry, which Henry's doing right now.
I think that's interesting with how Henry, who meets Claire in the clearing, doesn't do it in the right order. But that's never really emphasized. It's never super the focus that's in the wrong order, because he's not so much Henry as he is an idealized version of.
I think especially, it's explicit almost, because we recall in previous episodes, we hear about all those rules older Henry was setting for himself. He wouldn't, reveal this, he wouldn't say that. He's hiding things from Claire. So it's very explicitly kind of a performance. He's pretending he's just married to someone else. Oh yeah, you're totally not my future wife. That is very much a kind of almost a confabulated version of himself that he was, presenting.
I'm seeing a lot with some people as well that I think the spikiness of this Clare and of this relationship isn't working for some people, whether they're new to the story, just show viewers, or especially maybe if they're really attached to the film or to an extent the novel. And I think I get where they're coming from. Like, I understand people wishing, I wish Claire had gone into the shower and comforted Henry, and we didn't get that scene with the domestic violence humor, and we just got, something gentler between the two characters. I totally get that. And, there are versions of the story that cater more to that desire for the relationship to be portrayed. But I think the show wears its heart on the sleeve, and I think the show is very open with the fact that this is how it wants the characters. It wants to be spikier. It wants to kind of be murkier with how the two characters in their 20s relate to each other and talk to each other. That's what the show is. And of course you don't have to like that. But I think the show isn't misleading people, in what type of romance it's offering. It's offering this kind of, and I really like it. I like that both 20s Claire and 20s Henry aren't super likable people all the time. They feel like real people to me because there's stuff about them I really like and there's stuff about them I really dislike. They feel like people in their 20s. They're inconsistent and they're often cruel, and then sometimes they're kind and they're very blinkered in how they think about things. I like that because the romance works so much more for me when they feel like flawed people that can kind of complete each other or, fit into each other in that way. But it's a struggle and it's a process to fit into each other that way. It's not something easily won. That really works for me because that feels like a real romance to me. But, it's all fictive, so I understand people that don't like how spike it is and they think, they should be nicer to each other all the time. And, we shouldn't have to be going through all these trials with him, and the show should be easing off that. I get that, but I think the show is very clear about how it wants to do the relationship, and so that's what we got.
Claire has a fairy tale version of her past and a fairy tale version of her future. Stop trying to judge this young man by the standards of who he manages to make himself into. Just take him as who he is.
A revelation of seeing Henry in the clearing, knowing that the haircut has happened, knowing that the change of clothes has matured him.
Clare Hampshire,
There's a huge sense of relief.
will you marry me?
Oh my God, at last, here he is.
This guy who's patient with me, who's kind to me, I'll let go of the fantasy version and commit to the real one.
Yes. Oh my God, yes.
Threading through some of those interview excerpts we've been hearing, I want to read a bit from an interview between Moffat and Consequence on this topic of Claire's naughty characterization we're talking about. Moffat says, "There's a version of Claire that's very easy to play and indeed very easy to write, where she's entirely passive, where she's the person to whom the exotic time travel man happens, and she just becomes a sort of cipher. So you need someone with tremendous vitality who understands that Claire, while she's happy about meeting the love of her life, is also a vital, angry, ambitious young woman who wants to do stuff. And so much as she might like the road she's been set on, she's certainly angry that she's been set on her road at all. It can really piss her off, It's, all right, thanks, I know how it ends now." Rose, Leslie, was the person who got that, the vitality, anger's the wrong word, vigor probably, rattling against it while kind of liking it. That kind of thing. I think it's a good metaphor for marriage anyway. It's great when you meet the love of your life. I loved it when I met Sue Virtue. You're so happy. It's a wonderful moment in your life, the best moment of your life even. At the same time, there's another bit of your brain going, oh, so it's you're the one I meet. So that bit's over then. That was the last hot date. There's a part of me thinking, oh, we're here now. I had no idea. I had no idea who it was going to be. No idea. As Claire says, that I was going to meet you today. I remember thinking that when I met Sue, just thinking, oh, so I met her now. There we go. We're on our way. A lot of people would affirm that that's true. So quickly. Love at first sight is very common and sort of simultaneously dramatic and quite prosaic. You just sort of think, right, so we're in that part of my life now, am I? It's great, but it's also that. So Rose was the person who could do that.
I think the idea of Claire just being really accommodating and really just totally smooth with Henry and everything just going totally fine and her being completely on top of things, I think it's kind of hard for me to picture. I think to be in a situation like Claire's must be so incredibly disorienting, like emotionally and psychologically. I think it just feels inevitable that she would be kind of unsure of herself and kind of be pushing Henry away at some times and drawing him closer at other times, and their relationship would just be incredibly tumultuous because it had such an incredibly bizarre beginning. Like, of course it's not going to go smoothly. Of course she's not going to be just completely accepting and docile about their relationship and everything.
And also, no relationships are smooth.
Yeah.
Like, none of them. None of them are smooth all the time. Nobody is always as accommodating as they could have been, right? It's drama. It's trying to talk about real life. And the book especially, I think what the film and lots of readings of the book really overlook is how knotty so much of it is. I think it's got such a complex sense of itself and approach to the story it's telling that doesn't always come across in when people talk about it, and they focus more on the ways in which it's more of a straight romance than it is this complicated story about complicated people. And I'm glad the show's leaning into that because, you know, it's interesting.
I think romance as a genre, especially, like, what people want from fantasy or sci-fi, it can be done in a lot of ways, but I think it's kind of a clearer thing in some ways. With romance, it's tricky because, you know, part of it is that wish fulfillment that you want. And of course, a lot of that can be through tragedy. Like, tragedies are the best romances, you know, in so many ways. But the kind of continually spiky thing and the continually trying to kind of, how do we sit with each other kind of thing, I can see that not clicking with what some people want out of a story, you know, like this and in this genre. But at the end of the day, a show is what it is. You know, a show isn't beholden to, you know, I'm in this category on HBO Max's UI or anything. The show is the creation that it is.
Also, let's not forget, you know, Claire's a female character on television, and women characters on television and film just generally just get so much shit, even for being even half as nuanced as their male counterparts. You know, they just get all kinds of shit. People seem to be really, like, open to the idea of, like, maybe the guy in a relationship is really, like, complicated and complex and brooding and moody and spiky and even maybe abusive at times. But, like, if the woman dares to, like, raise her voice, she's a bitch, I hate her so much. You know, it can get a bit ridiculous.
Yeah, I brought that up with the Breaking Bad example in one of these episode discussions, and I'm really seeing it with not all viewers, obviously, but especially in prestige dramas and stuff. Like, you look at Tony Soprano and you look at Carmela Soprano, you look at Walter White, you look at Skylar White. It's like the male characters are sometimes afforded this kind of allowance to be an arsehole or to be inconsistent morally, or, you know, even just in terms of general rudeness or niceness to other people. Partly it's just plain sexism. Partly I think it's a kind of habit of the prominence the male character tends to have in the narrative. Like, just by, like, the function of the show, you know, Skylar White is going to be kind of inherently nagging at the main character to stop doing the exciting narrative moving forward things. And you might morally be able to relate to her, but a lot of viewers will just be like, well, she's trying to make the show less interesting. You know, so I think there's that part of just why people kind of approach a lot of female characters with less allowance, is because they're used to them either being in roles where they're trying to, like, stop the narrative from propelling because the male character has the prominence and it's going to be moving the narrative forward with his criminal deeds or whatever in all these anti-hero shows, or, yeah, just kind of sexist tradition as well. But here, they're very much the co-leads, and the show is even, you know, Claire's the one the title is about. But I think there is a general pattern, you know, certainly with HBO shows and prestige dramas of, yeah, female characters being afforded less room to be a bit unlikable, whereas male characters get more of that generally, I think.
Sometimes when both halves of the screen relationship are generating conflict, people be like, oh, this is too much conflict for me. No, I can only handle one character generating conflict and the other one comforts them.
I think in something like Breaking Bad, it is still, like you say, there's lots of reasons, and Walt is the one driving the narrative and he's the point of view character. Even though it is still, I think, mostly or almost entirely sexism that gets Skylar that much hate. But it's even more sort of head-scratching with Time Traveler's Wife, because Claire is, if anything, more so the point of view character, no? She's in the title, like you say, And she's also the one driving the story forward. She is motivating their relationship. She meets him and tells them they're going to get together.
I think part of it is that, like Moffat said, in his view at least, Claire is partly the insert character. You know, like you read a I'm not calling the Time Traveler's Wife novelist because I don't think it's this, and I think it's more complex than this. But you look at like a young adult romance, and oftentimes the female lead is going to be pretty undercharacterized beyond very vague traits like she's clumsy, because that way it's super easy to insert into her. And then it's not so much that whatever the lead character's name is you know, the one that the guys are falling in love with. It's that it's you're the one the guys are falling in love with. It's like you're in the land that this series is about. If you undercharacterize a protagonist, video games do this all the time, especially, you know, then the person can just insert right on in there. And it's like, it's not so-and-so that all the aliens in Mass Effect are falling in love with. It's Neo they're all falling in love with. So I think there's kind of a relic of that from how at least some people read the book or might have seen the film. And also Henry, he's not the one the title is about, but he's the one with the cool time travel power. And so he's kind of the one driving the narrative in the sense of the stuff that might be super exciting to a lot of audience members, whereas Claire might have as much, if not more, centrality in the narrative, but she's not the one doing the cool high concept stuff so much. So I can understand why some people get attached more to Henry and less attached to Claire, even though she's kind of got some primacy as a character.
It is an excellent title from that perspective, in that it's highlighting Claire as the main character. You know, the title is describing her, but it is describing her in relationship to him. Who gets he's the only one actually identifiable by the title. It's his characteristic that defines the title and makes it unique. And she is defined in relationship to him and that characteristic. So even though the title is about her, it is about her in relationship to him, which is sort of the tension that the whole show's about and that the book's about.
You know, I think a big thing that links all these romances and sort of young adult novels and video games and stuff, and this idea of the, I guess, viewpoint character versus the target, quote unquote, of the romance. The idea of there being, I guess, a figure in the romance who is the quote unquote interesting one, like, so Henry, the one who has the crazy time travel gimmick going on and all that stuff, and also all of this angst that Henry has, you know, tragic past, you know, constant danger from time travel, constant, like, existential suffering and crisis, and he's just really suffering, and I think, like, you mentioned this thing of viewers maybe being more attached to Henry, and I think that's kind of what links these stories, in the sense that the person, you have, like, maybe the narrator, whatever, like the viewpoint character, is the less interesting one, because ultimately it's the target of the romance, so to speak. The one who the viewpoint character is kind of discovering and falling in love with, who is like the one who the viewer is also, I guess, like coming to be fascinated with, discovering along with that narrator and falling in love with. So it's maybe not even as far as self-inserting into the narrator, so much as just following along with the narrator's experience of falling in love with this very interesting kind of flashy character, you know, this romance object, object of the romance, so to speak. God, I keep repeating myself. And I guess like that's how I guess that sort of romance genre sort of echoes in Time Traveler's Wife, because you've got this maybe slightly passive protagonist who is the rock around which this river is flowing. So I guess my point being is that if you play up the actual interestingness and thorniness of Claire herself, that is going against some people's expectations. I think when you have people looking at the shower scene and people wishing, like, I wish Claire would be nicer to Henry. I'd have given Henry a big hug in that scene. I really want someone to go and comfort Henry. Like, I think it's that effect kind of taking place where because Henry is so set up to be an object of fascination and sympathy and maybe some pity and love, like, it just really, it ticks people off when Claire isn't giving Henry what they wish Henry would get, I guess. But I guess now that they're all huggy and kissy, I guess that's resolved.
No, yeah, I agree.
Do we think that the show's going to keep the clearing opening for the next series, if it gets a next series? Because it feels like we're wrapping up the clearing almost entirely for this series, and it's going to be done, and we're just going to move on.
I think they can get one more. I don't think they'll do it again next series, and I think they'll probably relish some new visual thing they can do.
Yeah, they've just about managed to justify it each time. Like, this time we have the drawing pad, but, like, if you don't have something like that to thread through an episode, then there's not really much point to it. I think there's a danger of this show starting to feel too much like ordinary TV. Like, at the start of this episode, when the cold open finished and the titles just kicked in almost randomly, rather than being really, like, built up to, that was kind of a moment where I was like, oh, that felt a bit like normal telly, rather than the, you know, Moffat extravaganza that we're so used to. You know, this is transcending ordinary television. So maybe that's just partly.
I like the idea that having a normal title sequence is a bit disappointing.
Oh yeah, it is.
like I'm expecting better.
Like, when you've had a show that's kind of been weaving all the time-hopping elements together in such interesting, cool ways, like, of course it's going to be a bit disappointing if you have something that feels a bit too normal, you know? So it's almost like you don't want the arbitrary conventions of television with, like, okay, title sequence goes here. You know, you don't want stuff like that to impinge on a free-flowing, interesting narrative.
I'm loving the use of the title sequence and the way that it just ties into everything. And like you say, this time it's a little bit of a stretch, maybe. It feels like an episode 5 of 6 kind of moment, where you're like, I'm basically out of ideas. I'm saving a good one for episode 6. This is what I've got left for episode 5. Dropping the sketchpad. But I reckon it will come to some climax next time, and then we'll have a new title sequence, which I'm weirdly excited about. I love that formalistic stuff.
Yeah.
I think it's so tasty.
I saw some complaints about the episode, just about the kind of dismal or angrier vibe of the show. Then one of them was they made the meadow look like trash. And it's like, yeah, it's a very specific adaptation. Totally get why it isn't for some people. But it's like, I see some people will like say, you know, they've made them like this and they've changed that, and I get why they did it, but it's so frustrating to me because XYZ, and it's totally fair, but yeah, it's, you know, 5 episodes in, it's not too early to judge away. You know, the show is telling you what it is, especially if series 2 swings around, it's going to keep being what it is, and so, yeah.
I think if you were really feeling like it, you could make something interesting out of the fact that the clearing feels a little bit like a set all the time. The whole series, I've been feeling the clearing feels a little bit like a set, because it is one. But it feels a bit like one. And I guess part of that is that it doesn't feel like it changes over time. It feels like the same place every time we visit it, which is sort of the point. And I'm not saying they made a set that looks like a set on purpose, but it has that neat effect of slightly surreal, fantasist version of events.
The fact that when Claire comes back to the clearing and it's all ruined is the first time she actually looks beyond its boundaries, so outside the set, to, you know, the like chimneys in the distance and the roads outside. Like, that's the first time we've seen out of that small enclosed area. So it is set-like in a way, because it was like this bubble where child Claire was almost sealed off from the outside world.
There's something a little bit more I want to say on the ending of the episode. 2 things actually. So one is, I'm seeing some people where it's like, I think maybe I'm the weird one here. Some people are, you know, they're rightfully pointing out, hey, that's kind of toxic, or, you know, falling in love should be da-da-da-da-da. I think falling in love should be like this. I think a healthy relationship is like that. I think this. And so the ending of the episode is bad because it's not like that. And I'm interested there, to what extent is this kind of thing a romance story? And to what extent is it like a romance model? And how much do we need romance stories to be romance models? Or how much is it just moments don't land for you because the music's swelling and you feel it's meant to be triumphant, and it's not triumphant to you because you disagree with the idea, or at least how it's phrased there? I'm a little bit uncomfortable with the kind of didactic idea that what the show has to like be about, how to be a good relationship. Like, Moffat's talked a lot about how the show is an exploration of love and loss, and how the show is an exploration of how marriage changes people and all that type of things. But I don't think the show is meant to be an instruction manual. You know what I mean? That's not really what I want out of it, or most TV at all, really. But it's a prevailing view. So yeah.
I guess the contentious issue there is to what extent the show is idealizing whatever it's presenting. And I think in the case of the show, I think the point is, like, Henry and Claire are kind of in this situation with all these problems, but what's good is how they're working through them to end up, being happy together ultimately. And I guess, like, there's an extent to which that's why we have all the swelling romantic music and lovely blah blah blah, the gilding of it, to kind of make these moments feel really, like, positive and cathartic in some ways. And I can see how you can sort of look at that and kind of make it look like, oh, it's making this out to be some sort of perfect relationship or whatever. But I think I think part of the point is that, like, there's no such thing as a perfect relationship. Like, these two characters are making the best of a really awkward situation, and so I think that's kind of I think that's the difference between idealizing their relationship and idealizing their, I guess, resilience at working through it and willingness to grow and change and make it work.
That was the kind of thread I was seeing with the Claire internal montage, then cut to Claire, how she was looking at him. That's what I was kind of getting from that scene. Obviously, that's not what it was saying to everyone, and it didn't have dialogue explicating that as clearly as Henry was, explicitly saying, I'm going to be someone else for you, which, Moffat might have clarified in his way.
I mean, it's worth remembering, at that moment, Claire says yes to marry him.
Yeah.
And she says that to the young Henry. I will marry you. Like, I will marry you. So that is like literally the act of her committing to be with young Henry and stop. It's not just this fling anymore. They are going to be married.
And they say I've been in love since the library. They're not saying I've only fallen in love with older you. They're saying I've always kind of been in love with you, which I know some people don't think that makes sense, or they don't think that works. And I can kind of get that. But I think it makes sense to me that loving someone and not really understanding your love for them and still kind of disliking them as you love them, I think, love spawns in weird ways. That makes sense to me, that she was actually in love with him in a way, from the library onwards. Or even this kind of retroactive thing of now she's understanding this Henry is Henry. They're all the same Henry, that the love is kind of a retroactive thing as well. I can see all that. But what interests me is, and this is so fascinating, some people who are saying stuff like, I really agree with what Moffat says in interviews. In interviews, Moffat has a really good grasp of the characters. In interviews, Moffat has a really great grasp of the themes of the stories. But in the episodes, it's just not cutting it. Moffat is making clumsy lines that aren't actually exploring the themes in the way he's talking about. What do you think of that? That's so interesting to me, that view. Never really seen that before. Like, people like saying, I totally agree with what this creative is saying in their interview segments, but I don't agree with how they're putting it into their writing.
I can see the argument that it's too obvious. Moffat's got a very, here are the themes way of writing. But I don't see that you wouldn't see the themes being explored in the show at all. That's odd.
I guess it's maybe the way Moffat communicates the themes, because often he uses structures that kind of reveal things and reveal information and flip things around. And in a way, he's clever. He's clever with himself a lot of the time. And maybe that often leads to people getting maybe shunted down wrong alleys. People wondering, like, why was Claire fixated on the fireplace? What does that mean? When's Moffat going to solve the fireplace arc? Stuff like that. I think sometimes his style of writing can mislead people in terms of what is being said.
I think he also oscillates a bit from really loud thematics, like a lot of Henry's speeches, and then kind of quieter things where he's kind of like offering you to interpret it how you want, and it won't kind of be clear to a lot of people that, that isn't, just one way. That can be read in different ways. That's
a good point. Yeah, the switching back and forth between very loud themes and sort of subtle themes can sort of throw people off. Like, they're expecting everything to be as loud as the loud stuff. Or, conversely, they're expecting everything to be as subtle as the subtle stuff, so they get fixated overly on things that are quite obvious.
We've absorbed so much of his stuff that I think we gel with it quite easily, because it's much clearer to us how he works and like what he's saying, just because we've engaged with so much of his writing. But it makes sense to me why, and I don't think it's an ignorant view of the show at all. People who it's not so clear what he's trying to express, whereas it might be clear to them in interviews where he's very explicit about it, but in the episodes where it's kind of switching between really loud Henry speech about a theme, but then kind of a quiet, you take this how you want. I'm not necessarily saying this is healthy or this is unhealthy. You take that how you want. I can understand how that might be less clear or confusing to some people, But, you know, like we're always drawing connections with Joking Apart and Doctor Who and different shows because we have this kind of Moffat meta language in our heads of what he's trying to do. So it does make sense to me why some stuff might not work for some people. That which it might well do if they keep reading Moffat interviews, which they agree with, and they, you know, kind of gel with his mind more. Maybe the show will work more for them in future.
I think part of the joke-telling logic of the way you write stories is that the loudest themes or the loudest emotions will be the wrong ones. They'll be the misdirects. In the same way that it's very easy to watch Heaven Sent and get what it's saying about how you have to punch grief to death. That's a very loud theme in that episode. And the reveal that it's wrong is a little bit more nuanced, and it feels obvious when we've watched it 26 times. But it's something that's definitely not as loud as it is the first time round. It's not as loud as the misdirect is, because that's how misdirects work. They have to be big and showy and, look at me, I'm a target. Where the actual reveal can be knottier and more complicated and not a big proclamation. It's the same reason people assume that the biggest speech a character gives is the most true thing they say, because it's the loudest thing they say.
Yeah.
So it must be the most true. But so often the actual nuance comes in, you know, a look after the speech is finished that undermines the whole thing. And that's the actual meaning. But that's, you know, also the bit that's easiest to miss.
And I like this diversity of opinion, though. You know, some opinions frustrate me for sure, but it's nice to have a show or to have a career of this writer where people will come at it in super different ways, and people will kind of have their own journeys with it. People might like something at first and then dislike it later on, or the other way around. I like all that. So yeah, I'm not trying to condescend to people who stuff isn't working for. I think it's interesting and a valid view to see it that way. But it just interests me to see how different stuff plays for different people, especially people who are reading the interviews and stuff as well. And I really like that, because it's kind of pushing. I know Gig said in an earlier discussion that it's getting a bit much how Moffat is like over-explaining stuff in interviews, and then the show feels like it's just kind of pilfering from the interviews. From that kind of perspective, I really like that some people can like Moffat's interviews and then dislike the show, because it shows that there's not necessarily just a one way, you know, forward for that kind of thing, but that there are, you know, nuances and differences in the Moffat speeches and in the Henry speeches, which is good. The last little bit of commentary stuff I found interesting was I saw some people saying, and an interesting note, that it may be notable or noticeable to some people that men are behind the show, in the sense that Moffat's the sole writer. I see people keep referring to like writers' rooms and stuff like that. I guess it's just Americans used to HBO stuff, but it's all one guy. And David Nutter, who's another man directing all the episodes, with the idea that, I'm paraphrasing online comments I've seen here, that the romance is replaced by, you know, big sci-fi existential ideas and questions and very wordy, quippy arguments and more action, to appeal to the HBO audience or whatnot. Whereas, you know, implicitly the novel is, I guess they're construing as more feminine in a way. I think that's interesting. I don't really have a response right now. It's something I'm going to be thinking over. But I mean, yeah, a man is directing all the episodes and another man is writing all of them. It's very much based on a woman's novel that the man writer adores. But yeah, that's an interesting point.
Well, this is something that came up in an earlier week. I think you mentioned in the similar way that how, I guess, Niffenegger put some of herself into Clare and Moffat put some of herself into Henry. Sorry. I guess there's a degree of like cross-pollination there. And absolutely, and it is a factor. Like, if, you know, I can totally see why some people are going to be kind of disappointed or put out that this version of the story has such kind of, the distinct stamp of a male writer who is like the most, like, maybe not as male a writer as you could get, but just pretty much on the way there. I mean, a guy whose maleness is completely irremovable from his writing, and along with heterosexuality and everything else. But I think, to a certain extent, I think the reason that, maybe, well, I mean, it feels ridiculous to say it works for me. I'm a guy as well. So, I have absolutely I have no grounds on which to complain about any woman viewer or anyone who is interested in women's perspectives to be annoyed that the show has like a guy stamp on it. Like, that's completely understandable. But I think when it comes to this specific story and how it's playing off the novel and playing off this idea of Henry as this kind of dashing figure who's also like both subject, object, who's really naughty, and just sort of barges through life in this time traveling sense, and just like the act of adapting it, almost like this almost Henry-like figure adapting the story about Henry. There's something really fascinating about it that I can't like sort of put aside. So it's got a real fascination for me. It's not going to be for everyone though.
Yeah, maybe there's a balance between, the novel is from Niffenegger, and so there's the kind of Clareness there, and then the show is from Moffat, and there's the Henryness there. Is it like a chemical melding, thing that we're kind of mixing the two ethereal stuff together, or is it overweighted in Moffat's direction? I can't say. I don't know. I guess the only thing I'd push back on maybe, and it's so obvious that it doesn't really bear mentioning, but like obviously a lot of women are gonna like and prefer the more existential stuff the show is doing to the novel. There's going to be plenty of women like that, and there's going to be plenty of men who prefer the more internal kind of nature of the novel. But yeah, I'd be interested, anyone, man or woman's thoughts on what might have shifted in kind of the gender presentation of the story between Niffenegger and Moffat, who are very similar in a lot of ways and very different in other ways. Interesting question. Hard to answer, but interesting to hear what people have to say there.
I think it might well be more frustrating if Moffat as a writer was uncritically masculine. If it was an adaptation because it's definitely an adaptation that masculines the story a bit. There's more sense of Henry's perspective being a masculine one and talking about that and what it means. And I think that could have been frustrating for me personally if it wasn't being written by a writer with a lot of thoughts and a lot of things to say about his own and his character's masculinity.
Some stuff I think is just shifting it to TV. No matter who was showrunning it, there's stuff from the book that you put it in a visual medium and it's going to have a different prominence. I'm thinking of action here. An action scene in a book is a very different thing to an action scene in a TV show, which is going to inherently be kind of exciting and propulsive in a way that it might not be in prose so much. And so there's a certain kind of, I think, primacy Henry was going to get no matter what in the TV show, regardless of who was adapting it. But yeah, that's getting into woulda, shoulda, coulda kind of stuff. So yeah, I'm going to terminate that.
I find myself objecting to that dichotomy that you mentioned earlier of existential stuff versus romance stuff. This idea that they're two separate things. You're either doing one or the other. They can't be like one and the same in any way. I find myself disagreeing with that because I think to a real extent, and what I think certainly this version of the story is about, is that these existential questions are like deeply woven into that sense of like finding out who you are and what it means to love another person, because those existential questions are just bearing down like continually. They're there. Like they aren't like just like a separate thing.
What existential questions is the show asking that aren't about romance? That's not rhetorical. I'm trying to think of some.
It's like mortality isn't necessarily about romance. Like mortality is more something that everyone goes through individually, like romantic or otherwise. And there's stuff like the sense of like in Ingrid, for example, when she finds out that she's probably going to die very soon. That's not like very romantic between her and Henry. Yeah. But like at the same time, that whole idea is linked into the romance because in the sense that, as episode 2 makes very clear, you don't have that much time on this earth, so being with who you want to be with and like, having love in your life is super important.
I feel like the show is quite disinterested in this episode explicitly has Henry being super disinterested in how the time travel works. It's not like the show is ponderously spending its time on causality, web of time, existential timey-wimey stuff. It's very explicitly not interested in that and very interested in romance. But, the way that romance is being realized, it's different from the novel. So I can see people, coming to it differently.
I will say on the masculinity, if you'll allow me to be a little bit uncritical.
Go.
Please, I want your perspective.
I wouldn't have complained about a director with more interest in Henry's body. Like both from a personal watching as the audience point of view and from a critical point of view, I think it's a shame because Claire's romantic and sexual interest with Henry is so important. It's a shame that he's forced to be naked several times an episode, just constantly, all the time. It's the main fabric of the show, but it never really gets framed sexually, apart from when Claire is doing the schoolgirl naughty hiding clothes thing, which feels to me more like sexualizing her than it is him.
I most enjoyed playing the 16-year-old version. The clothes that I had to wear, but then also the kind of long, straggly hair. It was fun. It was kind of like playing again.
Maybe the scene where the little sister turns up for the first time and she's like, wow, tight. And she's like, like feeling him up a little bit. Maybe that's like one small example of maybe the kind of thing you mean, rather than when he's like forcibly, like suddenly thrust into some horrible, dangerous situation. Like him getting beat up by bikers is not exactly like beefcake fan service moment, is it?
When the quote about Moffat watching the rushes and like covering his eyes when he was naked on set, I'm like, this is where me and you diverge.
You know what it is? We keep hearing about the amazing, wild sex life that young Claire and young Henry are having. It's all off screen. If more of that was on screen, that would sort of address what you're talking about. This idea of like, I guess, showing more of like, I guess just the idea of like Henry and Claire, and Claire's nakedness in like a sexy and cool way, rather than like a hunk of, I don't know, flesh.
But it is fun that they most of the sex scenes are framed with especially last episode, the recurring bit of cutting to the after party and they roll over in bed, right? That last episode had that 3-beat thing of sleeping with Gomez, sleeping with the other one, sleeping with Henry, and we skip the actual sexy times. I just think that's interesting. Does the film focus more on sexy romance?
That'll definitely be something to discuss when we do a discussion for the movie the week after the finale. From memory, it feels a little more central, just in that the movie feels more romantic with how it packs everything in and the kind of focus it takes. But there's less nudity. There's some, but there's less in the show. And I wouldn't really say it feels that much more sexual than the show. I'd say it feels a bit less from memory.
What I'm saying is that this is HBO. And why would it be on HBO if we weren't going to see dicks swing?
And it's a Game of Thrones director making the show, so...
Well, there's still one episode left of this season. There's still time.
And yeah, that concludes our discussion on the 5th penultimate episode of the 2022 series of The Time Traveller's Wife. One episode to go. That's quite exciting. A finale to the whole show or just season 1. We'll probably find out soon enough whether there's a renewal coming or not. I'd love to know what people think about whether the show's going to get a season 2 or not, how it's going to work if it's just a season 1. And yeah, let us know your opinions on this episode, the series so far, our thoughts on this episode, our thoughts on other people's thoughts on this episode. Anything you got, we always love to read those. And thank you very much for listening to our conversation. Thanks.